The dust was so thick on her fingers that when she pulled the thread through the worn leather, it left streaks like dried tears across the back of her hand. Frances Fairchild sat on the splintered steps of the boarding house in Lovelock, Nevada, her head bent low over the only pair of shoes she owned, trying to keep the sole attached for just one more week. The late afternoon sun of August 1882 beat down mercilessly, and sweat dripped from her brow onto the cracked leather as she worked the needle through holes she had made and remade so many times the material barely held together anymore. She did not hear the horse approach until its shadow fell across her lap. Frances looked up, squinting against the glare, and saw a man sitting astride a bay mare, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. He was tall even sitting down, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of creek water in spring. Dust covered his clothes, and a worn hat sat low on his forehead, but there was something about the way he held himself that spoke of quiet strength. "Those shoes look like they have seen better days," he said, his voice low and gentle despite the observation. Frances felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She tucked the shoes closer to her chest, as if hiding them now would erase what he had already seen. "They serve their purpose," she replied, lifting her chin with as much dignity as she could muster. The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion and approached slowly, as if afraid she might bolt like a startled rabbit. He removed his hat and held it against his chest. "Name is Dalton Monroe. I have been riding fence lines for the last 3 weeks and just got back into town. I did not mean to make you uncomfortable, miss." "Frances Fairchild," she said after a moment, relaxing slightly at his respectful distance. "And I am not uncomfortable, just not accustomed to strangers commenting on my belongings." Dalton glanced at the boarding house behind her, taking in the peeling paint and sagging porch. "You staying here long?" "As long as my money holds out," Frances admitted before she could stop herself. She did not know why she was being honest with this stranger, but something about his steady gaze made her want to tell the truth. "I came west from Missouri 3 months ago. My father passed last winter, and my mother the spring before that. There was nothing left for me there but debt and bad memories. I thought I might find work here, maybe as a seamstress or a cook, but positions are scarce." "I am sorry about your parents," Dalton said, and the sincerity in his voice made Frances blink back sudden tears. "That is a heavy load to carry alone." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the whisper of wind through the sage brush that dotted the edge of town. Frances noticed the way Dalton's hands worried the brim of his hat, turning it slowly between his fingers, and she realized he was nervous. The thought made her smile despite herself. "Where are you working now?" she asked, more to ease the tension than because she expected an interesting answer. "The Crescent Ranch, about 10 miles north of here," Dalton replied, his face brightening at the question. "Been there 4 years now. Good outfit, fair boss. We run cattle mostly, some horses. It is honest work, and I like being out under the sky more than being cooped up in town." Frances nodded, trying to imagine what that life must be like. She had spent most of her years in a small farmhouse, helping her mother with washing and mending while her father struggled to make their few acres produce. The idea of wide, open spaces and freedom called to something deep inside her, though she would never say it aloud. "I should let you get back to your work," Dalton said, though he made no move to leave. "But if you do not mind me asking, what were you planning to do about those shoes?" "Mending will only hold so long." Frances looked down at the pathetic scraps of leather in her hands and felt the fight drain out of her. "I know," she said quietly, "but they are all I have, and I cannot afford new ones yet. Maybe in another month if I can find some work." Dalton was silent for so long that Frances looked up, wondering if she had somehow offended him. But his expression was thoughtful, almost calculating, and when his eyes met hers, she saw something that made her heart skip in an unfamiliar way. "I will bid you good evening, Miss Fairchild," he said finally, settling his hat back on his head. "But I hope I might see you again soon." Before Frances could respond, he was back on his horse and riding down the dusty main street toward the saloon. She watched him go, confused by the encounter and by the strange warmth that had settled in her chest. Shaking her head at her own foolishness, she returned to her mending, though her mind kept wandering to creek water eyes and a gentle voice that had asked about her troubles as if they mattered. The boarding-house dinner that evening was thin soup and hard bread, the same as every night. Frances ate slowly, making it last, while the other residents chattered around her. Most were men passing through, looking for work in the silver mines or on the ranches. There were two other women, both considerably older than Frances's 21 years, who kept to themselves and spoke in whispers about things Frances pretended not to hear. She retired to her small room as soon as the meal was finished, lighting the stub of a candle and pulling out the dress she had been altering for Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife. It was tedious work, taking in seams and adjusting the hem, but Mrs. Henderson paid fairly and on time, which was more than Frances could say for most people in Lovelock. As she worked by the flickering light, she found herself thinking about Dalton Monroe and wondering why he had stopped to talk to her. Men usually did not notice her, plain as she was, with her brown hair always escaping its pins, and her dresses worn thin from too many washings. Sleep came slowly that night, and with it came dreams of riding across endless plains on a horse that never tired, the wind in her hair and strong arms around her waist keeping her safe. Morning arrived too soon, announced by the rooster that belonged to the woman who ran the boarding house. Frances dressed in her least worn dress, a faded blue cotton that had once been her Sunday best, and carefully slipped her feet into the shoes she had mended the day before. They held, barely, and she offered a silent prayer of thanks as she made her way downstairs. The breakfast table was chaos as usual, with men shoving bread and bacon into their mouths before heading off to whatever labor awaited them. Frances accepted her portion, smaller than the men received but equal to what the other women got, and was just sitting down when a knock sounded at the front door. Mrs. Patterson, the landlady, shuffled over to answer it, grumbling about people calling at the breakfast hour. Frances heard a man's voice, low and respectful, and then Mrs. Patterson's sharp response. A moment later the old woman appeared in the dining room doorway, her expression sour as turned milk. "Miss Fairchild, you have a visitor," she announced, investing the words with deep suspicion. "A young man asking for you specifically. I hope you are not planning to bring scandal to my establishment." Frances felt every eye in the room turn toward her as she rose on shaking legs. "I cannot imagine who it would be," she said truthfully, though her heart had begun to race with a possibility she barely dared to consider. She followed Mrs. Patterson to the front door and found Dalton Monroe standing on the porch, holding a large parcel wrapped in brown paper. He had cleaned up since yesterday, his shirt freshly laundered and his hair still damp from washing. When he saw her, his face broke into a smile that made Frances forget to breathe for a moment. "Good morning, Miss Fairchild," he said, tipping his hat. "I hope I am not calling too early." "Not at all," Frances managed, though her voice came out higher than usual. "What brings you here?" Dalton held out the parcel. "I wanted to give you this. I went to the Mercantile when it opened this morning and spoke with Mr. Thornton. I hope I got the sizes right." "I had to estimate based on what I saw yesterday." Frances stared at the package as if it might bite her. "I do not understand." "Open it," Dalton urged, his smile widening. "Please." With trembling fingers, Frances untied the string and pulled back the paper. Inside were 3 pairs of shoes, far finer than anything she had ever owned. One pair was sturdy brown leather suitable for everyday wear. Another was soft black boots that laced up the side. And the third was a pair of low heels in deep burgundy with delicate buttons along the ankle. She gasped, unable to form words, her mind reeling with shock and confusion. "Why would you do this?" she finally whispered, looking up at Dalton with wide eyes. "You do not even know me." Dalton's expression grew serious, and he took a small step closer. "I know you have been dealt a hard hand, and you are trying your best to play it with dignity and grace. I know you came west alone, which takes more courage than most people ever need. And I know that when I saw you yesterday, trying to hold together shoes that should have been replaced months ago, something in my chest told me I needed to help. Maybe that makes me foolish, but I have learned to trust my instincts." Frances felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. "This is too much. These must have cost a fortune. I cannot accept them." "You can and you will," Dalton said firmly but kindly. "Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better. You can pay me back someday when you are on your feet. Or consider it a gift from someone who knows what it is like to be down on your luck and remember the kindness that helped him through." "I do not know what to say," Frances admitted, clutching the shoes to her chest as if they might disappear if she let go. "Say you will have dinner with me tonight," Dalton replied, his nervous energy returning. "There is a decent restaurant on the other side of town, the one with the blue door. Nothing fancy, but the food is good and the company would be even better if you agreed to join me." Frances knew she should say no. She did not know this man, and accepting such an extravagant gift after one conversation was improper at best and scandalous at worst. But when she looked into Dalton's eyes, she saw only honest concern and a hope so fragile it made her heart ache. Against every shred of common sense she possessed, Frances found herself nodding. "I would like that very much," she said softly. The smile that lit Dalton's face was worth every bit of risk. "6 o'clock?" he asked, and when she nodded again, he replaced his hat and gave her a small bow. "Until tonight, then, Miss Fairchild." Frances watched him stride down the street toward where his horse was tied, the parcel of shoes still clutched in her arms. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Patterson muttering about impropriety and young people these days, but Frances did not care. For the first time since her father had died, she felt something other than grief and exhaustion. She felt alive. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Frances finished Mrs. Henderson's dress alterations and delivered them, using the payment to buy a small bar of rose-scented soap from the mercantile. Back in her room, she heated water on the small stove and washed as thoroughly as possible, scrubbing away the dust and sweat until her skin was pink. She brushed her hair until it shone, then pinned it up in the most flattering style she could manage without a proper mirror. The burgundy shoes fit perfectly, as did the brown pair she tried on first. Frances could not fathom how Dalton had guessed so accurately, but she was grateful beyond measure. She chose to wear the black boots with her blue dress, knowing they would be more practical for walking to the restaurant. The leather was soft and supple, flexing easily with each step, and Frances caught herself smiling at the simple pleasure of shoes that did not pinch or threaten to fall apart. At precisely 6 o'clock, she walked out of the boarding house and found Dalton waiting by the gate. He had dressed in his best clothes, a clean white shirt with a dark vest and trousers that looked new. When he saw her, his face lit up with such genuine pleasure that Frances felt her nervousness melt away. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm. "Thank you," Frances replied, slipping her hand through the crook of his elbow. "And thank you again for the shoes. I still cannot believe you did that." They walked slowly through the evening streets of Lovelock, and Dalton pointed out various landmarks and shared stories about the town. He had a way of talking that made everything seem interesting, from the history of the old church to the time a herd of wild horses had stampeded down Main Street and caused 3 days of chaos. Frances found herself laughing more than she had in months, the sound feeling strange and wonderful at the same time. The restaurant was small but clean, with checked curtains on the windows and oil lamps casting warm light over the wooden tables. They ordered roast chicken and potatoes, and as they ate, the conversation flowed easily. Dalton told her about growing up in Texas, the youngest of 5 brothers, and how he had headed north after his parents died in a yellow fever outbreak. He spoke of learning to work cattle, of sleeping under the stars, of the way the sunrise looked from horseback when you had been riding night watch, and the world was still and perfect. In turn, Frances shared memories of Missouri, of helping her mother tend a vegetable garden that never quite produced enough, of learning to sew by lamplight and reading the few books they owned until the pages fell apart. She talked about her father's struggles and his pride, about the way her mother had faded after he died, as if she had simply lost the will to continue. Dalton listened with his full attention, asking questions that showed he truly cared about her answers. "What made you choose Nevada?" Dalton asked as they shared a piece of apple pie for dessert. Frances considered the question carefully. "I had heard there were opportunities out west, towns that needed seamstresses and cooks, places where someone like me might make a fresh start. I had just enough money from selling our few belongings to buy a train ticket and cover room and board for a couple of months. Lovelock seemed as good a place as any to try my luck." "And has it been what you hoped?" Dalton asked gently. "Not exactly," Frances admitted. "Work has been harder to find than I expected, and the money is running out faster than I would like. But I have not given up yet. I am not ready to admit defeat and go back to Missouri with my tail between my legs." Dalton reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch sent a shock through Frances, warm and electric and completely unexpected. "You do not strike me as someone who gives up easily," he said. "And for what it is worth, I am glad you chose Lovelock. Otherwise, we would never have met." Frances felt her cheeks flush, but she did not pull her hand away. "I am glad, too," she whispered. They walked back to the boarding house slowly, neither wanting the evening to end. The August night was cooler than the day had been, and stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Dalton pointed out constellations, teaching her the names he had learned during long nights on the range, and Frances stored each one away in her memory like precious treasures. At the gate of the boarding house, Dalton turned to face her, still holding her hand. "May I see you again?" he asked. "I know it might be forward of me, but I would very much like to spend more time with you if you are willing." "I would like that," Frances said, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "When?" "I have the day off tomorrow," Dalton said. "Would you let me show you some of the country around here? We could pack a lunch, take a ride out to the hot springs. It is beautiful out there, peaceful. I think you might like it." Frances hesitated only for a moment. Everything was moving so fast, and the sensible part of her brain was screaming warnings about propriety and reputation. But when she looked at Dalton, all she could see was kindness and hope and the promise of something she had never dared to dream about. "Yes," she said firmly. "I would love to." Dalton's grin could have lit up the entire town. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. I will come by at 9. Sleep well, Francis." She watched him walk away, then floated up to her room in a daze. That night, she carefully placed the new shoes in a row beneath her bed, running her fingers over the smooth leather and soft buttons. They were more than just shoes. They were a symbol of the fact that someone had seen her struggling and chosen to help. They were proof that kindness still existed in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. And most of all, they were a beginning. The next morning dawned clear and bright, promising another hot Nevada day. Frances dressed in her most practical outfit, a brown skirt and cream-colored blouse, and wore the sturdy brown shoes Dalton had given her. She braided her hair to keep it out of her face and packed a small bag with a few essentials. Mrs. Patterson watched her preparations with disapproving eyes but said nothing, which Frances took as a small victory. Dalton arrived exactly at 9, leading a gentle gray mare alongside his own bay. "This is Rosie," he said, patting the mare's neck. "She belongs to the boss's wife, but she said I could borrow her for the day. Rosie is sweet as sugar and steady as a rock. You will be safe with her." Frances approached the horse cautiously, never having ridden much beyond the old plow horse her father had owned. But Rosie nuzzled her hand gently, and Frances felt her nervousness ease. With Dalton's help, she mounted up, and they set off at a leisurely pace toward the edge of town. The landscape around Lovelock was stark but beautiful in its own way. All sagebrush and desert grass, punctuated by distant mountains that shimmered in the heat. Dalton led them north, following a trail that wound through rocky outcroppings and across dry creek beds. He pointed out plants and wildlife as they went, showing her which bushes the rabbits favored and where to find the best shade during the hottest part of the day. "You really love it out here," Frances observed, watching the way his eyes scanned the horizon with practiced ease. "I do," Dalton agreed. "I know it is not pretty like back east with all the green trees and flowing rivers, but there is something about this land that gets into your blood. It is honest, you know. It does not pretend to be something it is not. And if you learn to respect it, to work with it instead of against it, it can give you a good life." They rode for nearly 2 hours before reaching the hot springs, which turned out to be a series of pools fed by underground thermal vents. Steam rose from the water in ghostly wisps, and the rocks around the pools were stained rust red and brilliant white from mineral deposits. A few scraggly cottonwood trees provided blessed shade, and Dalton helped Frances dismount near the largest pool. "It is beautiful," Frances breathed, taking in the otherworldly landscape. "I have never seen anything like it." "Not many people come out this way," Dalton said as he spread a blanket in the shade and began unpacking the lunch he had brought. "The ranch hands know about it. Use it sometimes to soak away saddle sores and aching muscles. But mostly it is just wildlife and silence." They ate bread and cheese and cold chicken, washing it down with water from canteens. Frances found herself relaxing in a way she had not since before her mother died, the tension she carried in her shoulders easing as she listened to Dalton talk about his work. He told her about individual cows he had known, giving them names and personalities that made her laugh. He described the yearly cattle drives, the danger and exhaustion mixed with moments of pure beauty that made all the hardship worthwhile. "You ever want something different?" Frances asked, genuinely curious. "A family, maybe, or a place of your own?" Dalton was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the steaming water. "I used to think ranch work was enough," he said finally. "That I could be content just riding and working and sleeping under the stars. But lately I have been feeling like something is missing. Like maybe there is more to life than just getting by, you know. And then yesterday, I saw you on those steps, and something shifted inside me. I cannot explain it, Francis, but I felt like I had been waiting my whole life to meet you. Francis felt tears spring to her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. I feel it too, she whispered. And it terrifies me because I barely know you, but somehow I feel like I have known you forever. Dalton turned to face her, reaching out to cup her cheek with his hand. Then let us take the time to really know each other. No rushing, no pressure, just two people seeing where this path might lead. What do you say? Yes, Francis said, leaning into his touch. I say yes to all of it. He kissed her then, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as she responded. It was Francis's first real kiss, and she felt it all the way down to her toes. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Dalton rested his forehead against hers. I promise I will do right by you, he murmured. I will never give you cause to regret trusting me. I believe you, Francis replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They spent the rest of the afternoon by the hot springs, talking and laughing and stealing kisses when the mood struck them. Dalton told her about his dreams of someday having his own small ranch, just a few hundred acres with good water and grass for cattle. Francis shared her secret wish to open a dress shop, somewhere she could create beautiful things for women who wanted to feel special. They talked about the future in hypothetical terms, but the subtext was clear. They were both imagining a future that included each other. The ride back to town felt too short, and when they arrived at the boarding house as the sun was setting, Francis was reluctant to dismount. Dalton seemed to feel the same way, reaching up to help her down and then holding her close for a long moment. When can I see you again? He asked against her hair. Whenever you want, Francis replied. I am not going anywhere. Tomorrow, then, Dalton said. And the day after that, and the day after that, until you get sick of me and send me away. That will never happen, Francis said with certainty. They said their goodnights reluctantly, and Francis climbed the stairs to her room with her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She undressed and prepared for bed in a happy daze, replaying every moment of the day in her mind. When she finally slept, she dreamed of hot springs and gentle kisses, and a future that glowed with promise. The next weeks passed in a blur of stolen moments and growing affection. Dalton came to town every day he could spare, sometimes just for an hour in the evening, sometimes for a whole afternoon. They walked the streets of Lovelock together, sat by the river that ran past the edge of town, shared meals at the little restaurant with the blue door. Francis found herself counting the hours between visits, and when Dalton was away on the range for days at a time, she felt his absence like a physical ache. She also found that her luck with work had improved dramatically. Mrs. Henderson recommended her to several friends, and soon Francis had a steady stream of mending and alteration jobs. She even got a few orders for completely new dresses, which paid better, and allowed her to showcase her skills. For the first time since arriving in Nevada, Francis began to feel like she might actually make a life here. Dalton noticed the change in her circumstances and teased her gently about it. See, all you needed was a little good luck to get started. Pretty soon you will be the most sought-after seamstress in the county. I would settle for being able to pay my rent and eat regularly, Francis replied, but she was smiling as she said it. As September arrived and the weather began to cool slightly, Dalton started talking more seriously about the future. He had been saving money for years, he told her, and had nearly enough to buy a small piece of land that was for sale north of the Crescent Ranch. It had water rights and decent grazing, and the owner was willing to sell cheap because he was getting too old to work it anymore. I am going to put in an offer, Dalton said one evening as they sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the stars come out. If he accepts, I will have my own place by the end of the year. It is not much, Just a few hundred acres and a cabin that needs work, but it is a start." "That is wonderful," Frances said, genuinely happy for him even as a small part of her worried about what it might mean for them. "You must be so excited." Dalton took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I am excited, but I am also scared," he admitted. "Because owning land and running my own operation is a big responsibility, and I am not sure I want to do it alone. In fact, I am certain I do not want to do it alone." Frances's heart began to pound as she realized where this conversation was heading. She turned to look at Dalton and found him watching her with an intensity that took her breath away. "Frances Fairchild, I know we have only known each other for about 6 weeks," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I know that is not very long by most people's standards, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this. I love you. I love your strength and your kindness, and the way you make me want to be a better man. I love how you laugh at my terrible jokes and how you are not afraid to tell me when I am being foolish. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." He slid off his chair and knelt on one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "I know I cannot offer you much right now, just a rundown cabin and a lot of hard work ahead. But I can offer you my heart and my hand, and a promise that I will love you every single day for the rest of our lives. Will you marry me, Frances? Will you take a chance on a cowboy who fell in love with you the moment he saw you mending your shoes?" Frances could not speak past the lump in her throat. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded frantically, and then she was pulling Dalton to his feet and kissing him with all the love and joy and hope that filled her heart. "Yes," she gasped when they finally broke apart. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Dalton slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the lamplight. It was the most beautiful thing Frances had ever seen. They held each other on that porch for a long time, making plans and promises, laughing and crying in equal measure. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Lovelock. Frances wore a new dress she had made herself, pale green cotton with tiny pearl buttons, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Dalton had ridden out at dawn to collect. The ranch owner and his wife stood up as witnesses, along with Mrs. Henderson and a few of the other ranch hands who had become friends. The cabin on Dalton's new property was indeed in need of work, but Frances fell in love with it immediately. It had good bones, as her mother would have said, and a beautiful view of the mountains in the distance. They spent their first months of marriage fixing it up, patching the roof and replacing rotted boards and whitewashing the walls until the whole place gleamed. Frances planted a garden, determined to have fresh vegetables despite the harsh climate, and Dalton built her a chicken coop so they could have eggs. The work was hard, harder than anything Frances had ever done, but she had never been happier. She woke each morning next to the man she loved and fell asleep each night in his arms. They worked side by side during the day, building something together, and in the evenings they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Frances continued to take sewing jobs, riding into Lovelock once a week to deliver finished work and collect new orders. The money she earned helped with supplies and allowed them to slowly build up their herd. Dalton worked from sunup to sundown, tending the cattle and horses, mending fences and digging irrigation ditches. It was exhausting, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. Their first winter was brutally cold, with snow that piled up past the windows and winds that howled through every crack in the cabin walls. They huddled together for warmth, burning through their wood supply faster than Dalton had anticipated. There were nights when Frances wondered if they would make it, if they had been foolish to think two people alone could survive in such harsh conditions. But Dalton never lost faith, and his confidence carried her through the worst of it. Spring arrived like a blessing, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the frozen earth. Francis's garden began to grow, and the cattle that had survived the winter started to fatten up on the new grass. They had lost a few head to the cold, but not as many as Dalton had feared, and he talked optimistically about being able to add to the herd by fall. It was in early May, as Francis was hanging laundry on the line she had strung between two posts, that she realized she had missed her monthly courses. Her hands stilled on the wet fabric as the realization washed over her, followed quickly by a surge of joy so intense it made her knees weak. She sat down hard on the ground, one hand pressed to her stomach, and laughed through happy tears. That evening she told Dalton over dinner. He stared at her for a long moment, his fork halfway to his mouth, and then he let out a whoop of joy that sent the chickens scattering in panic. He swept Francis up into his arms and spun her around the cabin, both of them laughing like children. "We are going to be parents," he kept saying, wonder and disbelief mixing in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Francis confirmed, cupping his face in her hands. "You are going to be a father, Dalton Monroe, and I think you are going to be wonderful at it." The pregnancy was not easy. Francis suffered from terrible morning sickness for the first few months, and the summer heat made her swell up like a balloon. But Dalton was attentive and patient, taking over more of the household chores and making sure she rested. He talked to her belly every night, telling their child stories about the ranch and making promises about all the things they would do together. Their son was born on a cold January night in 1884, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. They named him Daniel James Monroe, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. Francis had never known love like what she felt when she held her son for the first time, and watching Dalton cradle the tiny boy with infinite gentleness made her fall in love with her husband all over again. The years that followed were full of hard work and simple joys. The ranch grew slowly but steadily, and Dalton's reputation as an honest and skilled cattleman spread throughout the region. Francis's sewing business continued to thrive, and she saved every penny she could in a jar she kept hidden in the kitchen. She had a dream she had not yet shared with Dalton, but she was waiting for the right time. Daniel grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed his father everywhere, and loved nothing more than being allowed to help with the ranch chores. Francis would often look up from her sewing to see Dalton walking toward the barn with Daniel perched on his shoulders, both of them chattering away about horses and cattle and the important business of being a rancher. When Daniel was 3, Francis discovered she was pregnant again. This time it was twin girls, Rose and Ruth, born in the spring of 1887 with matching red faces and powerful lungs. Dalton was utterly besotted, insisting that he needed to add locks to every door and window to keep the boys away in a few years. Francis laughed at his overprotectiveness, but secretly loved how devoted he was to their daughters. The cabin became increasingly crowded, and one evening as they lay in bed listening to the children sleep, Francis finally shared her secret dream with Dalton. "I have been saving money," she said quietly. "From the sewing work, I have almost $500 put away." Dalton raised his eyebrows in surprise. "That is a considerable sum. What are you saving for?" "I want to add on to the cabin," Francis said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Another bedroom for the children, maybe a bigger kitchen and a proper parlor. And I want to use some of it to buy more cattle to really expand the herd. We have been doing well, Dalton, but I think we could do even better. I want us to have security, to know that our children will never want for anything. Dalton was quiet for so long that Frances began to worry she had overstepped, but then he pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Here I thought I was taking care of you, and all along you have been planning for our future. Yes, Frances. Yes to all of it. We will build onto the cabin, and we will buy more cattle, and we will make this ranch into something our children can be proud of." The addition to the cabin was completed by the following spring, giving the children their own room and Frances a kitchen large enough to actually work in. Dalton used Frances's savings to buy 20 more head of cattle, carefully selected breeding stock that would improve their herd. The work increased exponentially, and they ended up hiring a young ranch hand named Tommy to help with the daily chores. By 1890, the Monroe Ranch was one of the most prosperous small operations in the region. They had nearly 200 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and more chickens than Frances could easily count. Daniel, now 6, was already learning to ride and rope under his father's patient instruction. The twins were wild and fearless, always getting into mischief and keeping Frances on her toes. Frances had finally given up taking outside sewing work, not because they needed the money anymore, but because keeping up with 3 young children and helping run the ranch left her with no spare time. She did not mind. This life, messy and chaotic and full of love, was everything she had never dared to dream of. One evening in late summer, as the family sat on the expanded porch watching the sunset, Daniel asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Papa, how did you and Mama meet?" Dalton and Frances exchanged a smile, remembering that hot August day 8 years earlier. "Well," Dalton began, pulling Ruth onto his lap while Rose claimed Frances's. "I was riding back into Lovelock after being out on the range for a few weeks, dusty and tired and thinking about nothing more than a cold beer and a hot meal. And then I rode past the boarding house and saw the most beautiful woman I had ever laid eyes on, sitting on the steps trying to mend her shoes. Your papa stopped and talked to me," Frances continued, picking up the story, "even though I was a stranger and probably looked like a mess. And the next morning he bought me 3 new pairs of shoes because he knew I could not afford them myself." "3 pairs?" Daniel asked, his eyes wide. "That must have cost a lot of money." "It did," Dalton agreed, "but your mama was worth every penny and more. Those shoes were the best investment I ever made because they gave me an excuse to see her again." "That is so romantic," Rose sighed, even though at 3 she had no real idea what the word meant. She had just heard her mother use it when talking with Mrs. Henderson. "Do you still have those shoes, Mama?" Daniel asked. Frances nodded. "I do. They are wrapped up in cloth and stored in the trunk at the foot of our bed. I keep them to remind me that kindness and generosity can change a person's whole life. Your father saw someone in need and chose to help, not because he expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. That is the kind of man I want you to grow up to be, Daniel. And that is the kind of person I want you girls to look for when you are grown." "I want to be just like Papa," Daniel declared with the absolute certainty of a 6-year-old. "Then you are going to be a pretty wonderful person," Frances said, reaching over to ruffle his hair. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Dalton started singing an old cowboy song his mother had taught him. Frances joined in on the chorus, her voice blending with his in comfortable harmony. The children listened for a while. Then Ruth started to fuss with tiredness, and Frances declared it was time for bed. The bedtime routine was well-practiced chaos, with teeth being brushed, stories being read, and last-minute requests for water and one more hug. By the time Francis and Dalton finally collapsed into their own bed, they were exhausted but content. "You ever regret it?" Dalton asked quietly into the darkness. "Saying yes to a cowboy you barely knew, taking on this hard life out here?" Francis rolled over to face him, just barely able to make out his features in the moonlight that streamed through the window. "Not for one single second," she said firmly. "You gave me more than just shoes that day, Dalton. You gave me hope and love and a family and a life beyond anything I had imagined. How could I possibly regret any of that?" "I love you, Francis Monroe," Dalton said, pulling her close. "More today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." "I love you too," Francis whispered, settling her head on his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Forever and always." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. The ranch continued to prosper, allowing them to build a proper barn and add even more cattle. Daniel grew tall and strong, eventually taking over more and more of the ranch work from his aging father. The twins grew into beautiful young women who had inherited their mother's skill with a needle and their father's head for business. In 1905, when Daniel was 21, he married a sweet girl from town named Sarah Mitchell, and they built their own house on the far end of the property. Frances became a grandmother for the first time when Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Frances Rose, and she cried happy tears when Daniel told her the name they had chosen. Rose and Ruth both married within a year of each other, to brothers who ran the mercantile in Lovelock. They stayed close enough to visit regularly, and family dinners became noisy, joyous affairs with grandchildren running everywhere and laughter echoing off the walls. Dalton's hair turned gray at the temples, and Frances developed lines around her eyes from years of smiling. They slowed down as the years went on, letting Daniel run most of the ranch while they enjoyed a quieter life. But they still sat on the porch every evening, holding hands and watching the sunset, remembering the day they had met and marveling at everything that had grown from that one moment of kindness. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1913, their children and grandchildren threw them a big party at the ranch. There was food and music and dancing, and at one point, someone asked Dalton to make a speech. He stood up, pulling Frances up beside him, and looked out at the gathered crowd of people they loved. "30 years ago," he began, his voice still strong despite his age, "I was just a cowboy with a good horse and a few dollars in my pocket. I had no family to speak of, no real home, and no particular plans beyond the next day's work. And then I met a woman sitting on some boarding house steps, trying to mend shoes that were beyond saving. I could have ridden right past her. I could have minded my own business and gone on with my life. But something told me to stop, and I thank God every day that I listened to that voice." He looked down at Frances, his eyes shining with love. "This woman took a chance on me when she had every reason not to. She married me when I had nothing to offer but a ramshackle cabin and a lot of hard work. She stood beside me through brutal winters and dry summers, through lost cattle and tight money, and all the 1,000 other challenges that come with building a life from scratch. She gave me children who have grown into people I am proud to call my own. She made a house into a home and turned my life into something with meaning and purpose. Everything good that I am, everything we have built here, comes back to her and the love she chose to give me." There was not a dry eye in the crowd as Dalton raised Frances's hand to his lips. "Happy anniversary, my darling. Here is to 30 more years if we are blessed to have them." "To 30 more years," Frances echoed, her voice breaking with emotion. "And to the cowboy who saw a woman in need and chose kindness. You changed my life, Dalton Monroe, and I would do it all over again in a heartbeat." They kissed as their family cheered and applauded, The same sweet kiss of two people who had loved each other through everything life had thrown at them and come out stronger on the other side. As the party wound down and the grandchildren were carried off to bed, Frances and Dalton retreated to their porch, their special place where so many important moments had happened. Frances had brought something with her, a cloth-wrapped bundle that she set on the table between them. "I thought you might like to see these," she said, unwrapping the cloth to reveal the 3 pairs of shoes Dalton had bought her so many years ago. They were worn now, the leather cracked with age despite Frances's careful storage. But they were still beautiful, still symbols of a moment that had changed 2 lives forever. Dalton picked up one of the brown shoes, turning it over in his hands with a wondering expression. "I remember how nervous I was that morning," he said. "Going to the mercantile before it even opened, trying to guess your shoe size based on one quick glimpse the day before. I was so worried I would get it wrong and you would think I was a fool." "You got it exactly right," Frances said. "Just like you have gotten everything else right for the past 30 years. You saw me, Dalton, not just the struggling woman with broken shoes, but the person I could become with a little help and a lot of love. You gave me the tools I needed to stand on my own feet, quite literally, and then you walked beside me every step of the way." "We walked together," Dalton corrected gently. "You gave me just as much as I gave you, Frances. More even. You gave me a reason to build something instead of just drifting. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. Those shoes might have brought us together, but it was your courage and strength and love that kept us together." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in memories of the long road they had traveled together. The night was warm and still, filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant call of an owl. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear their grandchildren's sleepy voices as they settled down for the night. It was perfect, this life they had built, and neither of them would have changed a single thing. "You think the children understand?" Frances asked eventually. "How lucky we are, how precious this is." "I think they do," Dalton replied. "We raised them to value hard work and family and kindness to others. They have seen us weather storms together, watched us support each other through good times and bad. They know what real love looks like because we showed them every single day. That is a legacy worth more than any amount of land or cattle." Frances leaned her head on Dalton's shoulder, fitting against him as perfectly as she had on that first day when they had kissed by the hot springs. "I am so grateful," she whispered, "for all of it. The struggles and the triumphs, the tears and the laughter, every single moment we have shared. You are my greatest adventure, Dalton Monroe, and I would not trade our life together for anything in the world." "Neither would I," Dalton said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You are my heart, Frances, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, always and forever." They watched the stars come out, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding vows, the births of their children, and every important moment of the life they had built together. And as they sat there on the porch of the home they had made, surrounded by the evidence of their love in every direction, they knew with absolute certainty that they had found what so many people spend their whole lives searching for. They had found each other, and that made all the difference. The years continued to be kind to them. Dalton remained active well into his 70s, still riding out to check on the cattle even when Daniel insisted it was not necessary. Frances kept her garden and continued to sew, though now it was mostly quilts for grandchildren and great-grandchildren rather than dresses for customers. Their love never dimmed, never became routine or taken for granted. Every morning they woke up grateful for another day together, and every night they fell asleep in each other's arms, still best friends and devoted partners after all those years. When Dalton finally passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Frances held his hand and told him one last time how much she loved him, how grateful she was for the life they had shared. She mourned deeply, but she did not crumble. He had taught her strength, and she honored his memory by continuing to live fully, surrounded by the family they had created together. Frances lived another 5 years, long enough to meet several more great-grandchildren and see the ranch continue to thrive under Daniel's management. She never remarried, never even considered it. Dalton had been her one great love, and she was content with the decades they had shared. When she joined him at last, her family laid her to rest beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains in the distance. They placed a simple stone marker that read, "Frances Monroe, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother." She walked in worn shoes and found a love that carried her through a lifetime. And in the house below, carefully preserved in a place of honor, sat 3 pairs of shoes that represented a simple act of kindness that had blossomed into a love story for the ages. The Monroe family would pass down the story for generations, teaching their children and grandchildren about the cowboy who saw a woman in need and chose to help, and the brave woman who took a chance on love when she had every reason to protect her heart. It was a reminder that the most extraordinary lives often begin with the smallest gestures, and that true love, once found, can weather any storm and last through all the years that follow.